I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the tires of my rig crunched onto the familiar graveled driveway. The endless highways, the solitude, they all faded away whenever I saw this old house. Brick by brick, Ruby and I had built our life here. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I killed the engine and sat in the stillness. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. My bones ached from the hours on the road, but the thought of Ruby inside, her warm smile and the scent of her cooking, usually made everything worthwhile. But tonight felt different. The porch light, which she always left on for me, was dark. The quiet of the evening pressed in, heavy and unnatural. I climbed out of the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel, each step heavier than the last. A chill crept up my spine. "Ruby?" I called as I pushed open the front door, but my voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No answer. Just the faint creak of the house settling around me. I flicked on the lights, blinking against the sudden brightness. The living room was spotless. Too clean. Like a stage set, pretending everything was normal. My eyes landed on the coffee table. A single piece of paper, folded in half. My heart pounded in my chest as I picked it up, the paper crinkling under my trembling fingers. The ink was smudged in places, as if she'd pressed the pen too hard. "Bernard. I can't do this anymore. It's over. I'm leaving. Don't come looking for me. Ruby." The word sliced through me. The room seemed to tilt, and I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. It wasn't just the note, it was the coldness, the absence of any emotion. She was gone. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled to the bedroom, praying it was some cruel joke. But her side of the closet was empty. The drawers she used to organize with such care were barren, save for a few stray hangers and the faint scent of her perfume. She had taken everything. I sank onto the bed, the sheet still rumpled from where she used to sleep. My mind raced, trying to grasp how this could have happened. Sure, we had our ups and downs, who didn't? But this? Without a word, without a fight? She just left? A buzz in my pocket snapped me back to reality. My phone. I fumbled it out with shaking hands, blinking through the blur of tears. A text from my neighbor, Mr. Preston. "Bernard, I'm so sorry. Ruby left with Walter. Saw them leaving together earlier today." Walter. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Walter Davis, her boss. The smooth-talking, slick-haired, too good for his own skin Walter. Ruby had always said he was harmless. Just her boss. Just a friend. Friend. Right. Rage flared hot and fast, boiling in my veins. How long had this been going on? How many times had she smiled at me, lied to me, while she was running off with that snake? The phone slipped from my grip, crashing to the floor. The screen shattered, but it barely registered. The anger wasn't enough to drown out the betrayal, the hollow ache in my chest. She was gone, and she'd left me with nothing but a torn-apart life and a heart that felt like it had been ripped to shreds. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, staring at the note, at the empty closet, at the broken pieces of my phone. The life I had known was over. And I didn't know what to do next. The days blurred into an endless stretch of nothingness. I didn't go back to work. Didn't answer the phone. The house felt like a tomb, silent, empty, and suffocating. I spent hours lost in my thoughts, replaying every conversation, every touch, every lie I hadn't seen. I kept asking myself, where did it all go wrong? The whiskey dulled the pain, turning everything into a hazy blur. The more I drank, the less I cared. It was easier that way, easier to forget when the world dissolved into the amber depths of the bottle. I stopped eating. Stopped sleeping. The only visitor I had was the gnawing ache in my chest, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. Mr. Preston tried. He'd knock on the door, calling my name, but I never answered. He left casseroles and sandwiches on the porch, but they went untouched, forgotten. I didn't need food. I didn't need anything. I just wanted Ruby back, but that wasn't going to happen. Not now. Not ever. One night, After too many drinks, I found myself staring at a picture of us from our wedding day. Ruby was radiant, her smile brighter than the sun. And me, I looked like a man who had everything he'd ever wanted. The man in that photo didn't know what was coming. He didn't know that one day, he'd be sitting alone in a dark room, wondering where it all went wrong. With a strangled cry, I hurled the picture across the room. The glass shattered against the wall, the sound sharp and final. But the pain didn't lessen. It sank deeper, embedding itself in my bones, a permanent reminder of what I'd lost. Outside, the rain poured down in relentless sheets, matching the storm that raged inside me. I sat by the window, watching the water streak down the glass. It was cold, unforgiving, just like my life now. "Bernard?" The voice startled me. I turned to see Mr. Preston standing on the porch, soaked to the bone. I hadn't even heard him knock. "What do you want?" I slurred, not bothering to mask the bitterness in my voice. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His eyes were full of concern, a sadness that made my throat tighten. "I've been worried about you, son." "I'm fine," I snapped. "Just leave me alone." Mr. Preston sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from me. He didn't speak for a moment, just studied me with those wise old eyes. "I know you're hurting, Bernard. I can't pretend to understand what you're going through. But shutting yourself off like this, it won't fix anything." I looked away, the whiskey-fueled haze dulling my emotions. What could I say? That I didn't know how to keep going? That every day felt like a mountain I didn't have the strength to climb? "I've seen a lot in my time," Mr. Preston continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I've seen people break, lose everything, and somehow, they find a way to keep going. You've got that in you too, even if you can't see it right now." His words hit me harder than I expected. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was just that I was so damn tired of feeling like this. But something inside me cracked, just a little. "I don't know how," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Mr. Preston leaned forward, his eyes softening. "One step at a time, Bernard. Just one step at a time." He stayed for a while longer, talking softly about nothing in particular. When he finally left, his words lingered in the quiet house. I sat there for a long time, staring at the broken pieces of my life, wondering if I could ever put them back together. Maybe. Just maybe. The night air was sharp, cutting through my thin jacket as I stepped out of the truck. The Christmas lights strung across the gas station flickered weakly, casting pale reflections on the wet pavement. Christmas, just another reminder of what I'd lost. A holiday that once meant everything was now just a hollow day on the calendar. I didn't know why I'd come here, to this rundown station miles from anywhere. Maybe I was trying to outrun the silence that haunted my house, or maybe I was just trying to feel something other than the crushing weight of despair. As I filled up the tank, I spotted her. A woman, hunched over near the entrance, her hands clutching her swollen belly. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her face twisted in pain. "Ma'am, you all right?" I called, my voice rough from days of silence. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear and agony. I think it's time," she whispered, doubling over as another contraction hit. It took a moment for her words to sink in. She was in labor, out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere. "Jesus," I muttered, hurrying to her side. "You're having a baby?" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please. I can't do this alone." I wasn't a doctor. Hell, I wasn't even a father. But I couldn't leave her here, helpless and terrified. "Come on," I said, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. "We'll get you to the hospital." She clung to me, her grip weak but desperate. Thank you. Thank you." We drove through the dark, her cries of pain filling the cab, drowning out the hum of the engine. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. What if we didn't make it in time? What if something went wrong? I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready for anything. The hospital's lights finally appeared on the horizon, a beacon in the darkness. I pulled up to the emergency entrance, shouting for help as soon as we stopped. Nurses rushed out, taking her from my arms, their movements quick and efficient. "Don't leave me," she cried, reaching for me as they lifted her onto a stretcher. "Please. Don't leave me. I'm right here," I promised, following them inside. "I'm not going anywhere." The delivery room was chaos, doctors barking orders, nurses bustling around, but all I could focus on was her. Her hand gripped mine, her face pale with pain and fear. "You're doing great," I told her, though I didn't know if it was true. "Just hang in there." Time blurred. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. But finally, the cries of a newborn filled the room, breaking through the tension like a burst of sunlight. The nurse placed the baby in her arms, and she looked up at me, her eyes glassy with exhaustion and gratitude. "Leroy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're here. You're really here." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Leroy? That wasn't my name." But before I could correct her, she drifted off to sleep, the baby nestled against her chest. I stepped back, my mind spinning. Who was Leroy? Why did she think I was him? But as I stood there, watching her sleep, something shifted inside me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel lost. I felt needed. And maybe, for now, that was enough. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with the low hum of voices and the clatter of trays, but I barely noticed. My coffee had gone cold, forgotten in my hands as I stared into nothing. Alice, the woman from the night before, was resting with her newborn son, but my thoughts were far from her now. Leroy. The name echoed in my mind, taunting me with questions I couldn't shake. Who was he? And why did she think I was him? I didn't have to wonder for long. A knock on the table jolted me from my thoughts. A man, mid-40s, with tired eyes and a face weathered by years of hard living, stood before me. In his hand, a small, worn manila envelope. "Bernard?" he asked, his voice gravelly, as if he hadn't used it in a while. "Mind if I sit?" I eyed him cautiously, my instincts on high alert. "Who's asking?" Ignoring my hesitation, he slid into the seat across from me, placing the envelope between us like it was a peace offering, or a bomb waiting to go off. "Name's Frank." I was a friend of Leroy's. The name hit me again, harder this time. My pulse quickened as I reached for the envelope. Inside, a photograph, worn, edges frayed, showed two young boys, identical down to the last detail. Their grins were carefree, full of life. Twins. "That's you and Leroy," Frank said quietly. His voice carried a weight that settled heavily in my chest. "Separated at birth. You were adopted by different families. He didn't know about you until it was too late." The world tilted, and I gripped the edge of the table, staring at the photo like it might disappear if I blinked. A twin brother? And now he was gone, dead, Frank had said. The knowledge landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of me. How did he die? The words barely escaped my throat, thick with the grief I didn't know I had. Frank looked away, his jaw clenched. Regret etched itself into every line of his face. It was my fault. Leroy and I. We got mixed up in some bad business. He trusted me, and I let him down. Got him killed. Rage surged through me, hot and sharp, but it was dulled by the grief that weighed me down. The grief for a brother I never got to know. "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded, my voice tight with barely contained anger. Frank swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. "Because I need to make it right. I've carried this guilt for years, and when I found out about you, I knew I had to come clean. You deserve to know the truth." I studied him, my emotions a chaotic swirl of anger, pain, and something else, something darker. There was no way to undo the past, no way to bring Leroy back. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to find justice. Or revenge. I wasn't sure which one I wanted more. I slipped the photograph into my pocket, my decision already forming in the back of my mind. "Meet me tonight," I said, my voice cold and determined. "We're going to settle this." Frank nodded, his eyes reflecting the same resolve. As he stood to leave, the weight of the truth hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I sat there for a long time after he left, the photograph burning a hole in my pocket. Leroy. A brother I never knew, a life that was taken before it could ever intersect with mine. But now, his story wasn't over. And neither was mine. Tonight, we'd find the ending. Frank's confession came slowly, as if each word pulled at the weight of his guilt. I set up the recorder, my questions sharp but quiet, and eventually, the dam broke. He recounted Leroy's betrayal, the mistakes that led to his death, and the years he spent haunted by the memory. When the police arrived, Frank didn't resist. He almost seemed relieved, as if being caught was the closest thing to redemption he'd ever find. Watching him being led away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a hollow sense of justice. But above all, I felt the weight of everything I'd lost, and everything I never knew I had. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn back to the hospital, to Alice and her newborn son. She had recovered well, her grief for Leroy still present but tempered by a quiet strength. There was something in her resilience that resonated with me, a mirror to my own struggle. We began to talk. At first, it was about Leroy, his smile, his quirks, the dreams he had shared with Alice. But soon, the conversations turned to other things. We shared stories about our losses, mine about the void Ruby had left behind, and hers about the life she'd imagined with Leroy. Somewhere in those talks, a bond formed. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness. Christmas Eve came, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Alice invited me over to her small apartment, where we spent the evening with Mr. Preston. He arrived with his famous pecan pie and a smile that seemed to warm the room. As we sat around the table, trading stories and laughter, I realized that this quiet, unassuming moment, was what I'd been searching for. Not perfection, not a flawless life, but the simple joy of connection. A chance to rebuild, piece by piece, from the wreckage of the past. Later, after the dishes were done and the baby was sound asleep, Alice and I found ourselves on the couch, the soft glow of the Christmas tree casting long shadows across the room. "I never thought I'd find this again," she whispered, her hand brushing mine. Her voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability there, a fear that this fragile new beginning might shatter. "Neither did I said, my words catching in my throat. But as I looked at her, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time: hope. When the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, I leaned in and kissed her gently. It wasn't a promise of perfection or a vow of happily ever after. But it was real. A promise of new beginnings, of healing, of something worth fighting for. Life didn't transform overnight, but it grew better. Slowly, Alice and I moved closer, and the months that passed turned our bond into something more. A love that grew not from grand gestures but from the quiet strength of shared understanding. We married the next Christmas in a simple ceremony, with Mr. Preston standing as our witness. It wasn't grand or elaborate, but it was ours, and that made it perfect. We built the life together, blending our histories and creating new memories, one day at a time. As for Ruby, she became a distant memory, a chapter I no longer needed to revisit. I had learned to let go, to stop chasing ghosts and start living for the future. Alice and I often visited Leroy's grave, bringing flowers and telling stories about the life he might have lived. It was our way of honoring the brother I never got to know, of keeping his memory alive in the only way we could. And as we stood there, hand in hand, I knew that whatever challenges life threw at us, we would face them together, with love, with hope, and with the strength we had found in each other. Because in the end, a happy ending wasn't about perfection. It was about finding the courage to begin again, no matter how broken you were before. If you liked this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.